Okay, so we're back in the light heavyweight division this weekend. After some recent action over the last few weeks in the division, which saw, of course, Sergey Kovalev defeat Jean Pascal via seventh round stoppage, and where Jürgen Bremer also defeated Robin Krasniqi. Now, first and foremost, just looking at this fight going ahead this weekend, it is, of course, for the WBC Light Heavyweight Championship of the World, and its current champion, Adonis Stevenson, is taking on challenger Sakio Bika. Now, just before I really talk about the actual fight itself, I just want to say, Jürgen Bremer, after his recent victory over Krasniqi, claiming that he's probably in the mix and he would like to get in the mix with Adonis Stevenson and Kovalev to try and prove that he could be the number one guy at 175 pounds. Whereas I would give Jürgen Bremer a chance against Adonis Stevenson, I wouldn't give him a chance against Kovalev. Styles make fights. Kovalev is all wrong for Bremer. In fact, I think he's so wrong, I think Bremer would be given nightmares, kittens, whatever you want to call it, by Kovalev. But against Stevenson, two southpaws, that can both bang, and two southpaws that both have good technical ability but are both also open to frustration. So that one could be a lot more interesting and a lot more competitive. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about, of course, this weekend's fight. Now let's start off with the challenger, Sakio Bika. What do we know about him? He's had over 30 fights. He's got a pretty decent KO record. I think it's roughly around 60%, somewhere around there. He's also lost 6 times in his career, and he's had 3 draws. His most recent fights of any note would be against Anthony Durrell twice. Of course, the first one being a draw, a bit controversial draw at that. The second one being a points victory for Anthony Durrell. And the first of those 3 fights, of course, when he won the WBC super middleweight title by defeating Marco Antonio Paraban via a majority decision, which, again, in some camps could be called a little bit controversial. Just depends on what you're looking for. Now, in terms of career-wise, looking at Sakio Bika's career as a whole, it seems like the guy's been around for absolute generations, just because I think a lot of people remember him from a TV show called The Contender, which, of course, was a TV show held back in the mid to late 2000s, and was quite a good show for the most of it. But I think interest just dwindled towards the end, and they had to pull the plug. But if you look at Sakio Bika's fighting record in bigger fights, the most important fights, his first big one against the WBC super middleweight champion Simon Bayer, he lost. His second biggest fight of his career after that was against Joe Calzaghe, he lost. His third biggest fight after that was Lucien Butte, he lost. And then I believe after that it was Andre Ward, and he lost. And he also lost to Jean Mendy as well, although that was a disqualification. And back in the day as well, he did lose to Sam Soliman, who of course went on to win the IBF middleweight title, but was also on the Contender show alongside Sakio Bika. And that's where Sakio Bika ultimately got his revenge by beating Sam Soliman in that tournament / show after losing to Sam Soliman a few years previously. Now, just to round up, Sakio Bika, he's a solid fighter, he's a world fighter, comes up short in big fights. We've never seen him win big in a world title fight, never. Adonis Stevenson's a character, for me, where it really depends how you look at him as a fighter. Now, what I mean by that is, you can look at Adonis Stevenson and you see this, even though he's old, he's 37, let's not forget, he's no spring chicken in terms of age, neither is Sakio Bika for that matter, he's 35. But Adonis Stevenson, you can look at him and you can say, well, he's got the southpaw, and he's a bobbly southpaw as well. He's kind of that awkward southpaw that knows he carries power in the left hand, and he's not necessarily arrogant and cocky with it, but he's just, that hand is ready to go. I think is the best way to say. Like, he's one of those southpaws that you could, as an orthodox fighter, you can get behind your jab, you can keep moving to the left, keep doing what your trainer's telling you to do. But against someone like Stevenson, who carries that much power and arrogance in his left hand, he doesn't just throw it when he wants to throw it. He'll throw it like that, and it's the kind of punch that you don't see coming as a fighter when he lands that left hand properly. And we've seen that left hand land flush without the other fighter seeing it on several occasions, through to the Chad Dawson fight, the Travers Cloud fight, the Bellew fight, the Fonfara fight early doors, and obviously in the most recent fight against, what's his bloody name? Bamitsky, something like that. You know what I'm talking about. Can't really pronounce the guy's name. Shouldn't have even had a world title shot in the first place. Right? But let's ignore the flashy southpaw, ignore the speed, and ignore the hype, as it were, around Adonis Stevenson. And let's just look at a bit more detail into his victories, and let's look at a bit more detail into his actual performances. Okay? Let's start off with his first world title fight. Let's not go any further back than that, because that's unfair to anybody to do that. Because I think I'm a great believer of, once you get on the world level, you can only be judged on world level going forwards. It's unfair to bring up your past at that point. Yeah, you might disagree with me, but that's the way I view it. So when Adonis Stevenson comes out against Chad Dawson and knocks Chad Dawson out in the first round, it sends shockwaves through boxing. I remember watching the fight live, and I was like, shit, man, where the fuck did that left hand come from? You got like 50 Cent sitting ringside with Lou DeBella, and they're both like in shock. The arena is just going crazy. Let's look at a bit more detail there. Chad Dawson was coming off a defeat to his fellow American and super middleweight champ, Andre Ward. In that fight, he got knocked down a total of 3 times before being stopped. And there was rumours running rife before that Andre Ward fight and before the Stevenson fight that Chad Dawson was struggling in training and struggling in sparring, and was even rumoured that he'd been put on his backside a couple of times in sparring. Okay? Let's just look at Andre Ward as a fighter. World class, elite, fantastic on the inside, a little bit dirty. Not a hard-hitting fighter. He's not. You don't believe me? Go and ask Arthur Abraham, Sakio Bika, Carl Froch. Go and ask the guys that have been in there for 12 rounds with Andre Ward, and let them tell you that it's not his power that gives you problems. It's his speed, his movement. You can't hit him. That's what gives you problems against Andre Ward. Yet Chad Dawson somehow managed to find a way to not only be hurt by Andre Ward, but hurt repeatedly by Andre Ward. Now, I know people can say that fight was at super middleweight and that wasn't Chad Dawson's natural division, natural weight, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's a given. But when you're looking at a guy who then goes on to move back up to his natural weight to defend his world title against his mandatory, Adonis Stevenson, a fighter at that time who people were looking at and saying he's no more than a one-punch specialist. If you're Chad Dawson at that point, you're getting dropped in sparring, you're struggling, you've been put on your arse 3 times by a fighter that's been described as hit like a feather duster by fighters in the past. And you're going into a fight with a very well-known fierce punching southpaw with maybe not so much boxing ability as yourself. Doesn't that scream alarm bells for you? That screams alarm bells for me, because quite simply I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, if you look at the whole context of this fight, then in a matter of fact, Chad Dawson was probably destined to lose, and therefore it's maybe not such a big shock that Adonis Stevenson went on to defeat Chad Dawson. Maybe the only shock is that it was so quickly in the fight. Then you move on to Adonis Stevenson's second fight of 2013 in his first defence against Trevor's Cloud. Trevor's Cloud was coming off a defeat to Bernard Hopkins. And for me anyway, I'd never rated Trevor's Cloud as an elite fighter. I thought he held the IBF light heavyweight title for too long, and it was only going to be a matter of time before someone with anything about them or any boxing ability of any regard would come along and probably defeat Trevor's Cloud in style, which Hopkins did, and then Stevenson did. So you can't really look at that fight and say, that was a great victory either. I mean, it was a good victory, don't get me wrong. He beat Trevor's Cloud, who was there to be beat, but it's not the hype job that people try and make it out to be. Tony Bellew fight. Tony Bellew was a fighter that campaigned at light heavyweight for way too long, in my opinion, and many other people's opinions. Reason being, he's 6'3", and he was struggling to drain himself in weight to make it to light heavy every single time he fought. And there was no more evidence than that in the fight between him and Isaac Chilemba. The first fight, that is, not the second one. The first fight between Tony Bellew and Isaac Chilemba. Tony Bellew looked weight drained. His power, his natural power at 175 was no longer existent when he stepped in the ring with Adonis Stevenson. And also his resistance to a certain point, because of the weight draining, I think wasn't quite there. I'm not saying that the result would have been any different, but what I'm saying is when you're fighting a guy that you kind of look at and you say he's not natural for this division, you can only use your strengths to combat their weaknesses. And Adonis Stevenson did that, and it was an impressive victory for me. Tony Bellew tried, but his power wasn't there. The sting in the punch wasn't there. And I just think at that point, I think Tony Bellew even realised after the second round that maybe it was a mistake still campaigning at light heavyweight rather than moving up to cruiserweight a lot sooner in his career. So I don't look at that as that victory as impressive as it is either. Now, you could say I'm being harsh right here, but I'm just saying think about it. Think about that debut year as a world champion in mid to late 2013 with the 3 fights that Stevenson fought. If you look at the details of those fights more accurately, the victories aren't actually as impressive as what they might look on paper. And then going into 2014, we're kind of then saying, with Kovalev on the rise, we're saying, okay, this fight's got to happen. This fight's got to happen. Well, you've got to go and fight Bernard Hopkins. That time we had Bernard Hopkins, Kovalev, Stevenson, 3 champs in the division. And people are saying, Stevenson, right now, he's the shit hot one. He's the one making the inroads. He's going to be this. He's going to be that. And then Stevenson signs a fight to fight Fonfara. And then you look at the Fonfara fight, and you watch Fonfara go down early doors, and you're thinking, here we go, typical Stevenson fight. And then something happens. Something happens is Stevenson's landing that left hand flush, and Fonfara starts eating them for breakfast and walking through them. And then all of a sudden Fonfara is taking control of the fight. Then all of a sudden Stevenson's put down. And all of a sudden Stevenson's gone from this cocky, flash, confident southpaw with a big bang to a, oh shit, what the fuck is happening here? And he had one of those moments in that fight. He came through the fight. He won it on the scorecards, more than thankfully, because he had a really good last couple of rounds. But for the first time, he came up against an opponent that was actually ambitious and live and natural at the weight and can take a punch. And he struggled throughout the middle to late rounds of that fight. He really did. And it was the first time we'd really see Stevenson, not so much tested would be the right word, but put in a situation where he had to do something other than just bang and move. He had to do something a bit more. He had to think. He had to combat what his opponent was actually doing to him in the middle half to second half of the fight, rather than laying it on his opponent and making his opponent think about what he's going to do. So I think it was the first time we've really seen Stevenson in that position. And he wasn't impressive. Now, his latest fight against Komotsky, whatever his name is, I'm not interested in because that guy shouldn't have been fighting for a world title in the first place. That was a stay busy, look good fight. Yeah, no disrespect to the guy, but it really was a stay busy, look good fight. Stevenson finished it in the 5th round. There you go. That's all needs to be said about that fight. Okay. So, what have we really learned then going into this fight this weekend? Sakio Bika doesn't really show up for big fights or can't handle big fights, but he has got a very good chin. Stevenson can be very easily frustrated if he doesn't get his own way and hurting the guy early on in the fight. Both guys have got a decent amount of speed, and Sakio Bika has got a decent punch. I'd probably say he's got a better punch than Fonfara has. Okay? So then when you're asking me to sum off this little video here and do a prediction for this weekend's fight, I think the obvious prediction is a Stevenson victory, either by a late stoppage or a unanimous decision. But then, you know, it depends for me what Stevenson shows up. If Stevenson goes out there banging and swinging early doors and doesn't get Sakio Bika out of there, which I think is a very big possibility, could we see Sakio Bika taking control of the fight in the middle to later rounds? And with Sakio Bika being a very much more experienced campaigner and former world champion, unlike Fonfara, would we think Sakio Bika would have the experience, therefore, to use his ability and use his boxing brain to frustrate Stevenson further and outbox Stevenson going into the later half of the fight, to try and make Stevenson walk back onto Bika and then Bika to try and land something big later doors? Because if a similar storyline, in my opinion, if a similar scenario happens that it did in the Fonfara fight last year, where Stevenson's going to be put on the spot to have to think about what he's going to do to combat what his opponent's going to do, rather than the other way around, against a more experienced campaigner and seasoned fighter in Sakio Bika, I think he could come across a lot more problems than he did against Fonfara. Now, of course, this is just all personal opinion. Stevenson, we know, has got the power, and he could just go out there and bang Bika out in the first round on Saturday night, and I don't think anyone would be surprised. But, and it's a big but, Sakio Bika deserves a lot of credit. And even though he's not really shown up in world title fights in the past to an extreme level, I mean, what I mean by that is, of course, like, he's never emphatically won a world title fight. The world title fights that he has won, or only won one, was a close majority decision. Okay? So it's an interesting fight. I still expect Stevenson to win. I would probably say scorecards, unanimous decision, maybe somewhere on the regions of maybe 116 to 112, 115 to 113. I do expect Sakio Bika to have his moments in this fight and win not a fair share of the rounds, but a few of the rounds. So we'll see. But like I say, it's an interesting fight for me. I'll be watching it with intrigue. So let me know what you guys think. Leave me a comment. Please subscribe. Peace.